Okay, so tonight, welcome everybody to Political Science 501, Intro to the Graduate Study of Politics. Um, and tonight we have Dr. Pierceson with us. All right. So, Dr. Pierceson, tell us something about your early upbringing. Where were you born, and what was life like there, etc. And in the next question, we're going to get into the politics society. So, if you want to.
Well, I was born in a small town called Morrison, Illinois. It's up not far from Davenport, Iowa. Someone's from Davenport, about an hour, maybe 45 minutes from Davenport, Iowa. It's close to the Mississippi River. It's northwestern Illinois. It's a very rural area, small town, a lot of small towns, cornfields, soybean fields, cattle, that sort of thing. Um, through high school, and then I went off to college in another part of Illinois, and then off to graduate school. So it's an interesting area. It's very rural, very small town, very homogenous, um, not very diverse from perspectives. But it's close to the Wisconsin border and good cheese and beer, not far away. So there's some relief in sight generally.
All right, that gets us right to the edge of number two. Tell us something about the politics, society, and culture of that place.
Well, it's dominated by agriculture. A lot of big farms, family farms, corporate farms. Um, the ag industry is probably the dominant industry. There are a few pockets of industry manufacturing in the area. I mean, it's cities, Rockford, Quad Cities, Dubuque, in Iowa. It's kind of an industrial town that's close there. So some industry, mostly agriculture, pretty conservative. It's definitely been part of the polarization sorting of rural America into conservative Republican politics. You know, most of the area where I'm from is I grew up in a county called Carroll County, which is about a county south of the Wisconsin border. It's a pretty small town, a pretty small county, not a lot of urbanization. But when I was young, 30 or 40 years ago, Democrats held office. There was a Democratic sheriff. There would be Democratic elected officials. Now that would be unheard of, virtually unheard of in that county, for there to be any kind of a Democrat elected to any kind of office. So it's I grew up in a working class family. My father worked in a steel mill. We weren't really part of the agriculture economy. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, but she had been a nurse before that. And I think, and my father was more politically active than my mother was, and he was a union Democrat. Steel working at steel mill, steel worker. He became a truck driver. Very pro-union, very democratic. But he died maybe 20 years ago. I think he might have been a Trump voter eventually, because I think a lot of the profile of rural Trump voters would fit my father to a T. When I see that evolution happening politically, I can see it happening in my family. I can see how a lot of, rightly or wrongly, a lot of rural voters have gone to the Republican Party away from the Democratic Party.
Thank you. So, when did you know that political science was a path for you, and who made the most impact in your decision to pursue graduate school?
Well, I got to a PhD program in political science indirectly because my first route was through law school. I wanted to be a law professor, but I realized that a lot of money to borrow to go to law school. And back when I was applying to law schools, there were a lot more applicants than slots, and it was pretty competitive. There were not as many scholarships and funding, so I actually attended the University of Iowa Law School for about a week, and then realized it wasn't the right thing to do, and I got out of that and ended up going a year later to a PhD program. But I thought a law professor avenue was my path, but what I realized, that's a very narrow path. Most lawyers practice law; they don't become law professors. It was more, if I wanted to teach and be in academia, it was more realistic to get a PhD and go academic route that way. So I'd always been in the back of my mind thinking about an academic career, and I had an undergraduate professor, a couple of them, who with that fire under me a bit. I did a lot of research as an undergraduate, and I certainly wanted to have a scholarly path. But it took me a while to get there. And I worked in higher education. I worked in the admissions office for a few years after I graduated. And I really never left higher education since I went to college. So I worked as a staff member in higher ed, and then I realized that's where I wanted to stay. So that's when I then decided to go get my PhD in political science. And because I like to study law-related issues in the courts, that it made sense to have that as a focus in political science as opposed to law school. So now I study lawyers and I write about lawyers, but I'm not a lawyer.
All right. Please describe some of the courses you teach, and several people already know, so it'll be great for the rest of us to hear.
Yeah, I have two primary graduate level courses at the 500 level. One is called Courts and Policymaking. That is PSC 519, and that examines how courts are embedded in the larger policymaking system. And we try to think of judges not just as jurisprudential actors, but also political actors, and see how politics influences judges and courts, and see how courts and judges influence the political process. I also teach, as I think at least one or two of you were in this class. So some of you have taken that, courts and policymaking. Others have taken, in the summer, I teach a seminar on constitutional theory and interpretation. That's more of a standard constitutional law theory class, originalism and living constitution things and feminist thought and all kinds of things. So it's newer. I've taught it a couple times, but it seems to have gone over well. So there are two graduate level courses. I teach other undergraduate courses. Thought, Introduction to Political Philosophy. My subfield, my major field in graduate school was judicial politics, public law, but I also have a subfield in political theory. So I do some more undergraduate classes, but none of you might have access to those given the way the curriculum is designed.
Yeah. How would you best describe your teaching style and teaching philosophy?
Well, I think for graduate students, it's very seminar based. When I teach online, in particular graduate school, it's asynchronous. So there may be recorded or written lectures that I will present, maybe some reading questions, but a lot of it revolves around discussion boards where students react to the readings. So I try to put the students in charge to a certain degree of the interpretation of the material, the master of the material, and then there are the papers that go with that. So I try to replicate. It's not a real time graduate seminar face to face, but I try to give students the leadership in the academic journey in that process as much as possible in my graduate classes. And so readings are central. It's, we discuss reading, we read a lot, we discuss a lot, we write a lot.
Great.
So what we would do, a standard face-to-face seminar, a lot of that happens in the online context, as I'm sure you're experiencing in all kinds of settings in the program.
Excellent. Other than the subject matter, what do you want your students to leave your classroom with? So is there anything other than the topics covered which you would like them to internalize?
This is pretty standard critical thinking, writing, thinking like a scholar is important to understand. So not just a knowledge base, but understanding the literature, understanding what we know, we don't know about a particular field or subfield, learning to see where the gaps in the literature might be, or what things have not been studied, what could be studied. So thinking creatively about a literature, both knowing that literature, knowing who the major thinkers are, the major scholars are, but also trying to understand the limitations of the literature, what hasn't been studied, or what needs further study. So I think that kind of approach is something I focus on as well.
Well, that is perfect. That's a big theme in 501, as we all know. So please tell us something about your scholarly interests.
Sure. So I study primarily courts and policymaking, to summarize, I suppose, mostly in the context of LGBTQ politics and LGBTQ rights. So the courts to supplement or pass and lobbying. There's a whole world of legal activism that is very consequential that people often don't think about in terms of affecting politics and policy. I want to illuminate that side of the political spectrum, or that end of the political spectrum. And a lot of the work I do isn't purely jurisprudential. Like a law professor might study a lot of doctrine, and that's important. But I try to study judges, activists, legal activists as political activists, and how they try to leverage the courts to achieve policy results. And then, so again, my main area of focus has been LGBT rights. So I also know a lot about LGBT politics, LGBTQ history, and so I've done work on that hasn't been strictly correlated on general LGBT issues. I wrote a textbook and an encyclopedia on LGBTQ politics. So I've done a lot of work in that area as well, just general LGBT politics.
And why do you think it is important to study what you study?
Well, I think it's important because the discipline itself often ignores it, particularly the role of courts. Political science is a discipline, mainstream political science, for good or bad reasons, but it's mostly about elections and public opinion, very much focused on executives, legislatures, less on courts. A lot of times, a lot of political scientists think that, well, that's the job of law professors to understand how the courts work mostly, and we're going to stick with the more electorally accountable, generally branches of government, although state judges are very tied to elections. So I think it's understudied in political science in general, and I think often misunderstood about how courts make policy. Sometimes it's over romanticized, noble crusading lawyers waving a magic wand and changing the world, or courts not being able to do anything. The truth is obviously somewhere in between. So I think bringing some light to understudied areas in the discipline is important. And I think LGBTQ rights is often, as historically understudied and has been understudied, and the discipline is gaining more steam now. But when I was in graduate school 20 or 30 years ago in the 1990s, 2000s, no one in my graduate program knew anything about LGBTQ politics. I had to learn that on my own. A few programs are incorporating that into the curriculum. So both in terms of courts and LGBTQ politics, I think both those areas are understudied, under-theorized, under-empiricized, if that's a word, in the discipline. And so I think that's why those are important areas of focus.
Excellent. You sound much better.
Good.
So what are the contributions to scholarship and to policy of your work?
Say that again.
What are the contributions to scholarship and to policy of your work?
Well, I think probably more to scholarship. I think my work has done, hopefully fit into the conversation about courts and social change. There was also, when I was in graduate school, a prominent theorist of the Supreme Court and legal mobilization was by Gerald Rosenberg. It was a book called The Hollow Hope, written in, I think, first published in 91 and then republished. I guess second edition came out in 2008. He was, I think he might be retired now, but he taught in the law school and the political science departments at the University of Chicago. And the Rosenberg thesis was that, and there's a little bit about this in one of the selections that I gave for this week, one of the readings, that courts are very limited policymakers. They can do almost nothing to independently achieve change. And that was the dominant view, I think, in the discipline 20, 30 years ago. And so the argument would be, in terms of LGBTQ rights, you shouldn't go to court, you shouldn't try to sue, you should talk to legislators or work through the bureaucracy or something, or do popular referenda to get marriage equality or trans rights, whatever it might be. And the idea was you should try to stay away from courts. But I think my work and the work of others has helped to establish a counter narrative or a set of findings that actually litigation, if correctly mobilized and thoughtfully done, can add a lot to policy change, and courts can, particularly for groups that are fenced out of the political process normally. The courts have unique attributes or different attributes than legislators or legislatures or executives that allow new voices in, give them some credibility, give them some leverage in the system that they can then use in the broader political debate in the country. So I think so expanding our knowledge of LGBTQ rights, and also I think my work has contributed to a more sophisticated understanding humbly, speaking of courts and social change and what the literature says about the ability of courts to independently achieve change. So my work generally says, yes, courts can be independent policymakers that aren't just simply ratifying what other policymakers are doing in legislatures or in the public.
So this question, I feel like you just had a book come out, but maybe that says more about my metabolism than anything else. But I'm wondering, what are you working on nowadays? So what specific topics motivate you to write nowadays?
But I did have a book come out last year, and I wrote that. It was my pandemic project, so like 2002, or so I had a lot of time on my hands, or we're all working from home, so it was a good time to write a book. And then I'm still working in that area, and that was about the case of Bostock versus Clayton County, which a chapter of the book I signed for tonight. I'll talk a little bit about in a hopefully very brief lecture, then we can discuss it. But that book was about the court and this pretty significant decision in 2020 where they ruled that sexual orientation, gender identity can be seen as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the context. So that's about employment discrimination in that particular context. It was a pretty remarkable decision. It was particularly from a more conservative court. There were two conservative justices, Gorsuch and Roberts, in the majority in that decision for various reasons. But it was the culmination of decades of work and activism, and it's tied to, in particular, to two cases that came decades earlier that people really didn't think much about in terms of the trans rights or the evolution of LGBTQ rights writ large. So it kind of speaks to how the book did, hopefully, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit more, how courts can maybe indirectly or accidentally achieve change because of the nature of legal reasoning and how the law evolves over time, or how it can be made to evolve by activists. So that was a lot of the work I've done the last few years. I'm still working on figuring out what's happening after that case. So the book was called Before Bostock, really exploring a lot of what happened before 2020. Now I'm working on how judges have interpreted that decision. And there's a strong ideological connection to this. And generally conservative judges, liberal judges have embraced Bostock. So Democratic appointees embrace it and expand it, apply it to other areas of the law, federal law in particular. Conservatives have been much more mixed. Some have respected it as a precedent. Others have tried to find ways around it, either by ignoring it or citing other cases that might be more prominent in their minds, and push the law in a more conservative direction. Because we're seeing this wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation coming from conservative states. So Bostock potentially is a bulwark against those laws, and a lot of federal judges have used Bostock to strike down some of those laws, but others have been allowed to go, and this is happening minute by minute. Their decisions handed out every day. So I'm kind of trying to get a sense of what's happening after Bostock, and that's going to be one part of a larger project where I'm trying to understand. I think hopefully will result in a new book project where I'm looking at conservative activism surrounding LGBTQ rights. Part of what we're seeing with this wave of legislation, hundreds and hundreds of bills from conservative states, is driven by a handful of narrow policymakers, ideological policymakers, the Heritage Foundation, a think tank, the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative litigation, almost, I would say, Christian nationalist activist group. And they are really having a tremendous effect in Republican policy circles. And so trying to understand how and why they're having such an effect, or have had such a rapid effect in the last couple of years, is part of that. So the thing I'm working on right now is the courts and how ideology has affected the understanding of Bostock in the courts. And I'll look at academia as a source of policymaking in this realm, think tanks, state legislatures, all with an eye toward understanding the particular take that conservatives have had on LGBTQ rights in the last few years. It's not been a very positive one, but they have a uniform, very strong and effective anti-LGBTQ rights position that they've taken, and activism that they've used based on that position that we're seeing in the headlines every day. So exploring those dynamics is where I'm thinking I'm going for my next big project.
Excellent. If students share your interests, what classes would you recommend they take?
Well, I think the courts and policymaking seminar, the constitutional theory and interpretation seminar. I mean, there are some cross-listed classes, I think, in legal studies that might be attractive to students as well.
All right. What would an MA exam or thesis look like under your supervision?
Students have done a range of topics. Sometimes they're more theoretical, maybe focus on legal interpretation, but oftentimes they're about what makes the courts tick or understanding why the Supreme Court has changed so dramatically, say going to overturning Roe versus Wade recently, what was behind that. So, some students have focused on LGBTQ rights and the courts. Some students have focused on feminist interpretations of the law in courts, on scholarship about the Supreme Court or justices, the Chief Justice. But I also had a lot of projects about polarization and ideology as well. I haven't had a lot, but I would certainly encourage projects and closure projects and master's theses about American political thought, political figures, Frederick Douglass, or feminist thinkers, or even Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, something like that. If you have it's interested in U.S. politics, historically speaking, I might be a good person for that as well. So we tend not to teach a lot of those classes about the graduate level, so we tend not to have students choose those things as topics for closure. But I certainly would be willing to work with students on American political thought, political philosophy, historical development, institutionalism. One of my training in graduate school was about historical institutionalism. It's kind of an alternative. It's was an alternative and still is to some degree to what we might call more mainstream behavioralism. And it really focuses on ideas and institutions and focuses on historical trajectories and developments over time. So if you have historically minded students, or if you are a historically minded student, I might be someone to talk to about potential closure projects.
Yeah, my knowledge of that literature is out of date, but just if people are seeing stuff that they like or find interesting, I'm thinking of authors like Roger Smith, who actually grew up in Springfield, Illinois.
Yes.
Stephen Skoranek, and then those are what other, how could somebody tell if they were interested in, and the shorthand for this is, one of the shorthands for this is APD, American Political Development,
right,
or American Political Thought.
Yeah, and I think there's a politics and history section of the American Political Science Association. So sometimes there's some overlap between political historians and people who study American political development. There is a journal that's called American Political Thought. And there's the American Political Thought subfield or group in the American Political Science Association. That tends to have a certain ideological disposition, mostly conservative, which is fine. There's a lot of good work in that area, but it's not the best outlet, I think, to do that kind of work. But you can at least get a sense of the work that scholars do, the kinds of things that are done, the kind of things they talk about, the kind of scholarship about political development, political thought over time, historical thinkers. There's a whole body of work about Lincoln's political thought. You mentioned Springfield, or and there's a lot to be done in those areas. Particularly if you want to look at the political thought of more recent political actors, there's a lot of work to be done, particularly for those who write a lot and think a lot and give a lot of speeches. It can be a good source of scholarly inquiry.
All right, final question of this phase. Recalling your experiences as a graduate student, what advice would you give to our MA students?
Give yourself time. I know a lot of folks in our program work full time and try to take a lot of classes, or maybe not, but I mean, it's hard to juggle all these things. Good scholarly work, good academic work takes time. Don't overstress yourself. Don't overburden yourself. I know it's easier said than done, but I think it's important to give yourself time and read carefully and thoughtfully. Don't be afraid of spending a lot more time than you think is necessary on something. Also, I think one of the things I want to come into tonight with points of advice is don't be afraid of books. Articles are a big part of political science. And I mean, the main way that we deliver information to each other in the discipline is through articles, journal articles. You can find a lot of those online, but a lot of the work that I do in the field that I do, subfields that I work in, American political development or political thought or judicial politics, a lot of the scholars publish their best work in books. And so it can be hard to find that material. You might have to order things in the library and they have to ship it to you, but it can be done. Our library has access to a lot of different titles. If they don't have it in their own collection, they can do through a library loan, get it from the library loan and ship it to you. There are a lot of ebooks that the library has, or you can find online, but don't forget about books is what I would say. I mean, I'm someone who writes books. I love books, but I think sometimes students get too focused on only finding the literature they need in journals, when a lot of what you might need or might be able to use is in books.
I really, really appreciate that point, because I'm an article. I have yet to write a book, so I'm all article driven, and so you guys, you folks should adjust for what I'm saying. I mean, you should hear Jason whenever I say article. You should hear Jason say book. So when we talk about the number of sources, it's not like a book counts as one source. I mean, a shorthand might be the number of chapters. It counts as that many articles, and the whole, how many sources thing is much more about coverage than bean counting. But yeah, so I know that we talked about interlibrary loan earlier in the semester, but they will send it, so that they'll send it to remote students, right? So when he's saying that they'll ship it to you, you don't have to be on campus to get books. And one of the things, yes, so I really want to emphasize that, and that is a bit of something that I naturally don't say as much as I should. So I really appreciate that point. Okay, well, we had somebody join us, so and since we're doing these little 10-second introductions, I think I'll get to that in just a moment. And then my understanding is we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Pierceson, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the comprehensive exam that you shared with us. I'm not sure how much, we didn't put that up as early as we might have, but so we'll say some stuff about it, and when people can look at it later, and we'll talk a few other things. I really appreciate Dr. Pierceson coming, because he addresses some of my blind spots in the kind of how-to stuff, and it's very important to know there's more than one way to study a topic.